This is a Radical Exchange production. Hello, and welcome back to the Radical Exchanges podcast. In this conversation, Matt Pruitt talks to Zizi Papacharissi about her latest book called After Democracy. They discuss the ways that social media affects our culture, our relationships, and consequently our democratic processes. They not only touch on the negative consequences of this, but also explore the potential ways that we can use this technology to imagine new and better forms of democracy. Zizi is professor and head of the communication department, professor of political science at the University of Illinois Chicago, and university scholar at the University of Illinois System. This is a continuation of our mini-season called A New Era of Democracy, and was originally filmed for our RXC TV program. We can't wait for you to hear from these brilliant innovators and the fascinating ideas being brought to the forefront. This is the Radical Exchanges podcast, and this is A New Era of Democracy.
Thank you so much, Zizi Papacharissi, for joining today.
My pleasure.
I'm super excited to be talking to today. Zizi is a professor and head of communication department and professor of political science at University of Illinois Chicago and university scholar at the University of Illinois System and the editor of many journals and generally one of the most eminent thinkers in media and communications that we have, and someone who's, I can't imagine a better sort of tour guide to help us think about how media and social media and technology are shaping our politics, and very, very honored to be speaking today. So thank you.
Thank you, and I love that title of an academic tour guide. You know, I've thought of myself as an academic flaneur as I was working on my latest book, but an academic tour guide is even better. I'm going to start using that.
Great. So I would love to talk a little bit about your most recent book called After Democracy, but I'm thinking maybe before we get to that, it would be good to lay some of the foundations from some of your earlier thinking. And in particular, I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about the idea of effective publics and what that means.
Sure. Sure, I'd love to. And I can tell you a little bit about, how that idea came about. I've been working on technology, democracy, and society for a long time. And I had wrapped up a few projects around 2010, 2011. And like all good ideas, that idea, and I'm hoping it's still a good idea. Most people find it a good idea. They come from a place of boredom. So I was just sitting around on a lazy Sunday afternoon. For me, it was not lazy for the world at all. There were a lot of very interesting social movements going on. I was following the Arab Spring developments as they were moving and transitioning from Tunisia to Egypt. And then I was also following, the burgeoning Indignados Occupy movements and what sort of presence they were attaining online, and in particular, how they were using Twitter to attain that presence. And now if you think back, on 2010, 2011, Twitter was a very different medium. I think before these movements, people mostly used Twitter to share personal thoughts, to often post pictures of what they had for breakfast, and that led to many conversations in mainstream media about what is the future of this, what is even the relevance. But once we saw many movements starting to just make a more direct use of the medium, the question that came up very often was, is Twitter, our social media, making the revolution, or is the revolution making a different medium out of Twitter? I think a little bit of both has happened. I with more heavily leaning on the latter. I think that these movements have transformed Twitter into a completely different vehicle and connective conduit that supports all kinds of publics. And this is the important thing to remember. I think when we first turned to Twitter as a medium, we were all very optimistic and enthusiastic about its promise for contributing to societal change. But as more and more movements turn to Twitter, we see it being infiltrated with a variety of content that revolves around hashtag hijacking, infusing movements with false content, trolling, sort of staffing movements with bots to create, a false sense of engagement. So I try to talk about that with this concept of affective publics, and I define that very, very plainly and simply as networked publics. Okay, publics, people across the globe who are coming together and they're connected, they're identified, but they're also potentially disbanded, disconnected through sentiment, through bonds of sentiment. So it's not necessarily, an ideological connection. It's not necessarily a conversation around shared ideology that's motivated this connection. It's usually a sentiment, a mood, a sense that, this is something that moves us, and we need to create some kind of signifier. That's usually a hashtag that allows us to stand up and be counted and be visible. And so we have, this is something that's happening with movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, but it is also facilitating movements that have deeply undemocratic consequences, or tend to misinform the public. And I'm speaking, of course, to the MAGA movement. I'm referring, of course, to several anti-vaxxing movements as well. So it's important to remember that effective publics support a number of different and can develop in a number of different directions. It's not safe to assume that just because one movement used Twitter to attain a certain kind of visibility and social media presence, that all movements will be that same. Every movement is unique, and then every movement leaves its own unique digital imprint, its own unique societal imprint. I'm going to stop here and let you get a word in. I have a few more things to say about the impact of these things, but you let me know.
So, so when I hear you describe this, I mean, the thing that I picture, and you can tell me if I've sort of got it right or not, is that groups of people were sort of forming into sort of clusters who co-sympathize with each other, and they may or may not really be on the same page ideologically, but they are sort of signifying their membership in the same group in some way, or signifying their kind of fellow travelerness with one another. And this can sort of point in any different direction, right? I mean, it could be bad, it could be good, it could be. Is that about it?
Absolutely, and I think this is why you see some people floating in and out of these movements. You also see, journalists trying to interpret these movements in ways, in traditional narratives, or try to put them in a very conventional frame that doesn't really fit the movement. So often, I think that was the case with Occupy. We had so many journalists asking, well, what is the agenda? What do these publics want? What is the ideology? And they were missing the point. The point was specifically that there was not to be an agenda. The point was to just demonstrate dissent, indignation with a particular mode of running things, of doing things. Now, unfortunately, that has also been co-opted and become the modus operandi of other movements that are less, that have less of a noble, noble motivation. But one thing to say about all of these things, all of these sort of public formations, and I think we're going to see more and more of them in the future because they are facilitated by social media. Social media work by bringing out the sentiment in us and allowing that sentiment to, just sort of run in a very viral manner. I don't think we're going to see with many of these change that's instant or instantaneous or immediately political, sociocultural, economic, legislative. I think in most cases, we'll see symbolic change or a symbolic meaning, symbolic value to some of these movements. And let me give you some examples. So, for instance, for a movement like Black Lives Matter, that phrase taken literally is interesting, obviously, makes a strong statement. taken symbolically, it attains a completely different gravitas in terms of uniting people and also reminding societies how little has been accomplished despite the years, centuries of civil rights struggles. Uh, so, to take that statement and interpret it in a literal sense, it leads to a deep misunderstanding of that particular movement. These movements also, they gain agency in ways that are discursive. So what they try to do is they try to change the discourse, to change the conversation, to say, well, we're using the wrong words to describe this institution with, or we have this institution and we need to rethink how we're using it. So take a movement like defund the police. It's not, again, do not interpret it literally. No, I think that's the least you can get out of it. Nobody's saying let's fire all cops everywhere. But what people are saying is let's reconsider what it is exactly that police officers do, what sort of training they do, what policing and law enforcement means in a contemporary democratic society, because we've been running law enforcement like we still live in the medieval centuries. And now, even with a movement like MAGA, I will say that, for a lot of these movements, this is both empowering and disempowering. The access to agency, the access to power, it's going to be of a liminal transitional nature. Um, that's neither good nor bad. I mean, it's not it's not meant to be judged in that sort of evaluative manner. I think it concerned us because when we saw crowds storming the Capitol building on January 6th, we were worried that that implied a lasting access to power. It does not. It's a fleeting access to power. We should be concerned if there's indication that there's, a structural connection to power. And I think many of us were worried about that because it took so long for law enforcement to respond. And I think that's something that's being looked into, that structural connection, with many of the hearings and the investigations that are taking place today. But there is that liminality of access to power that, well, can become, part of permanent structures, but that is something that'll take time. Revolutions are long, change is gradual. We have to be resilient and persistent.
I mean, it seems like if you compare these kinds of movements to prior, more traditional sorts of movements, one of the differences is that, more traditional movements might have had more of a sort of a discursive process going on within themselves to sort of define their goals or their ideology, whereas these are a little bit more blank slates, which means that they can form more quickly, but then also their power, is more liminal, more sort of ethereal or something.
Yeah, effervescent. Yeah, it's interesting. I've thought about this as well. I've thought about, to what extent is what am I describing new, or have we seen it in the past? And I think it's a little bit of both. I think there some of these trends, some of this effervescence is a little bit more amplified, more pronounced, more visible, and that has to do with the media that are used that sort of sustain that aspect. They sustain that intensity. It's very quick for something to attain intensity online and for that intensity to spread. But then, when I think about, some of the civil rights movements of the 60s as they took form in the United States, but also in many different countries in Europe and Asia as well, you're right. There was some pluralistic conversation on, what is our ideological agenda, and disagreement often that took place in face-to-face situations. I think there is some of that going on with these movements too, but online, in some ways, it's even more pluralized, even more inclusive. Um, I can't say, we'd have to think about whether the commitment is as lasting. But then when you go back and read at how the intellectuals of that era responded and reacted to those movements. You see a lot of people, Daniel Bell in the 60s talk about the end of ideology. And then, of course, 10 years later, he writes about the coming of the information society. And then you also see some other similarities. We used social media that have this, this affective appeal to them, but movements of the 60s used music a lot, which again has this very effective way of appealing to the senses. So people frequently united behind a song. They may not have shared agreement on every single ideological point of that particular movement that they supported, but maybe it was like a Johnny Mitchell song or a Bob Dylan song that brought them together, and so they marched to that, singing that. So it's a different medium that helps sustain that kind of connective narrative.
And I'm curious, how these sort of fit into your like hopes and fears. Because one way I could see these things evolving is that we develop better methodologies for sort of achieving coherence of effective publics, right? And for helping something a little bit more discursive go on within them. And then they just, they become a part of a healthy democracy, right? But then another thing, there's obvious dangers as well. Like for example, because they sort of form so quickly and because they form on the basis of affectivity instead of, careful deliberation, you can imagine different effective publics forming that think they hate each other, but don't, right? So that if they were actually talking to each other, they would find they disagree about less than they think they do. But the basis of their grouping is opposition to one another or something. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. When I finished writing Effective Publics, I was thinking, this could evolve in a number of different ways. And I turned that book in, 2013, and it's a book that involved a number of big data analysis and also more qualitative analysis of Occupy and the Egyptian uprising that led to the regime reversal of Hosni Mubarak. So I had very mixed feelings. I was worried that, while we're seeing some positive effects here in terms of visibility, but, we really kind of have to sort of wait and see whether, substantial regime change is going to follow. It's very difficult for me to write about that at the time because there was a lot of enthusiasm about what was happening. And I think there was a lot of, perhaps in the United States, we haven't played a part here because all too often I think we have a certain idea of what democracy is, and we tend to sort of project it and often almost impose it upon other countries. So I was very skeptical about, whether that change that we're seeing was going to be lasting. I mean, you have to understand, I was born in Greece. When I was born, there was a dictatorship in the country. On the day I was born, there was a referendum to vote out the king because there was also a king together with the dictators. They weren't getting along, so the dictators wanted to kick him out. I think that's the one good thing that came out of the dictatorship. And so my mother voted on the referendum to vote the king out, and then the same night gave birth to me, which I think is weirdly symbolic when you think about the work that I do. But many of us who grew up in regions that have suffered through, political upheaval, have a country like Greece has like such a long but also fragmented history and experience with democracy. We just tend to be very apprehensive of just how quickly things can turn around. So I was worried, but nobody really wanted to listen to my concerns. Although in the conversations that I was following on Twitter, a lot of the people on Egypt on the ground were very skeptical as well about Morsi, about that government, and for good reason, as we were able to see. And now, of course, we've evolved to a different sort of platform that is hospitable, and platforms that are hospitable to a number of different causes that articulate themselves through a variety of different ways, ways that are frequently manufactured, manufacturing consent, manufacturing visibility, if you want to take that Chomskyan point a little bit further, making things visible. And these are often things that actually don't have very much support behind them. So, there's this perception of visibility, of support, but there's actually, once you dig beneath the surface, you do some digital forensics work, you just find bots and spiders in
Yeah.
there, cobweb.
I'm also curious. I mean, I hear people talking about the idea of performativity a lot, and I'm curious how it relates to, sort of affectivity in this context. So, the idea of, I mean, I know there's a lot to say about this, and I'm sure we could, but the idea of performativity is sometimes used pejoratively, as if to suggest that like there's a way of communicating that is less performative or more authentic, which is being displaced by a more performative kind of communication. I'm not sure what to think about that, because on one level, I think that all communication is performative, right? We're always performing.
True.
Nonetheless, there are some distinctions that can be made. For example, it's different to be, when two people are talking to each other one-on-one in private, there are like fewer people being performed to than when people are talking on social media, when people are talking in a public situation. And I'm curious what you think about that. Do you think that there is some kind of quality to communication that happens in smaller settings or more one-to-one settings that we should normatively desire compared to the more sort of like one-to-many communication, which increasingly is what a lot of communication ends up being?
Yeah, that's such a rich question. I mean, I'd probably have to start by saying that you're right. Performativity can be used in a pejorative manner. But really, I think it comes down to questions of security and insecurity, which in my mind, insecurity explains 95% of the world's problems. But so here's what I think. I think people are forced to be performative in some way when, for some reason, they don't feel secure in their environment. They don't feel that they're going to come across as their true selves, as who they really find themselves to be. They're not going to present a version of themselves that really they feel represents who they want to be, how they feel on the inside. So they resort to a variety of different strategies. Now, that's not something to blame individuals for. I mean, all too often, think of the politicians, and all too often we have them communicate to publics in stages and platforms that really invite the performative. I mean, show me one person who feels at home on a television screen. How is that a natural environment, a natural habitat for the human being? Everything about that environment is fake, is constructed, down to the set, the lighting, the makeup, everything. So for somebody to go on TV, I say in my latest book, After Democracy, politicians have to play a part in order to appear to be themselves on TV. You take someone like Hillary Clinton. She behaves, normally. We don't like how she looks. She then tries to put on a different sort of performance. Then we find that a little bit too affected. It's very confusing. It's especially challenging for women, too, for publics of color as well. There's a fascinating concept that a scholar named Erlina Joseph came up with. It's called strategic ambiguity. And there she talks about how women of color often, upon arriving to a room, they just have a practice of reading the room and just figuring out basically what it looks like and how black can they be, or whether they need to sort of put on a different kind of performance. It's sad, because we are not providing the circumstances that allow people to feel secure enough to to communicate in a way that feels authentic to them. But then now I will also say that it's very difficult to do that in mass societies, and that gets to the point where the one-on-one, one-to-many. How can you do that in a conversation that involves more and more people? An authentic and impromptu and a spontaneous conversation. It's very difficult for that to scale up. We can do it, uh, but we have to figure out how to design technologies and design environments, not just technologies, spaces that support that. And the thing is that frequently when we're designing spaces, the number one criteria is, the efficiency, economy. And then, an afterthought is, oh, and by the way, does this work? Is this appealing to people? Not, that sort of thing. So in After Democracy, I talk about that as, let's make capitalism softer. Let's make democracy stronger by reversing this trend.
All right. So I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, can you explain your thinking around the title of After Democracy? In a way, it's sort of a provocative title, and I'm curious. I'm curious how you arrived at it.
It is a provocative title, and it's often people are worried when they hear it because they think I'm speaking about some sort of I'm speaking about the end of democracy, basically, that I'm talking about. I've seen some things and they're alarming and they're going to make democracy go away. But that really wasn't my starting point for that book at all. My starting point was quite different. I started thinking about the book during the Obama presidency. Um, and I would be giving a lot of talks on affective publics, and I was thinking through the trends. You mentioned some of them before, where you said, "Where are we really all thinking the same things, but we need to find a better way of talking about them?" So as I was traveling the world thinking and speaking to people about these things, I would get into conversations with random strangers, like the cab driver who took me to a talk, or just, like the security personnel that I would chat with as I was, waiting to go on stage. And I thought, what if I could just pull all these conversations together and turn them into a story about democracy? But I wasn't writing that story because I was worried about democracy going away. I was writing that story because I was seeing politicians who were interested in doing very different things with the world that we live in. And I felt often, as I was observing them, and one of them, of course, is Barack Obama, I felt that they were trapped in structures that were old, that they were dated. I felt like we were making them sleep in the bed that they slept in when they were 6 years old, or get them, to fit into the clothes that they were wearing when they were teenagers. And we were trying to do the same thing as well. So I felt we were running a very dated version of democracy. And here we had people around the world, actually, not just in the United States, who had come from the future or who had come from like just a very energized present, and they were kept bumping into very just sort of stiff, rigid structures that were pulling them back. So I wrote After Democracy because I wanted to ask the question, of what about democracy? Is it the best thing that we can come up with? Is it the only thing that we can come up with? It's been around for thousands of years. It doesn't really scale up very well. It was invented within the scope of a society that was very different. Uh, can we evolve beyond that? Is there something beyond it? Is democracy the final stop in our civic journey, or are there more stops? Are there stops, 3, 4, 5, infinite number, and then we can kind of use technology to build out railways, in the same way that we did, to support and invest in the railway infrastructure, and then connect us to other worlds. Use technology in the same way to connect us to others and help reinvent some of the way that we function civically.
Yeah. So, I mean, all of those themes are very close to my heart and close to what we're working on at RadicalxChange Foundation. And I mean, I'm also struck by the way that the book is put together sort of instantiates a democratic ethos because you center the voices of a very large, diverse group of people and let them sort of articulate an idea of what comes after democracy or what's next. And I've a couple sort of questions about that. One is sort of, how did you make the choice to structure the book that way, I guess? And also, having gathered all of these voices together, how do we scale it up, right? How do we take all of these ideas and sort of translate them to the next level of organization and democratic infrastructure? And it kind of this, I'll put a pin in it already. Like it already kind of touches back on what I was suggesting earlier, which is that there's something in the one-to-one conversations, right? Because these interactions that you had that were the basis of the material in the book were one-to-one. Now, they also become public through the book, but there's a certain sort of safety or security that the people who you were talking to undoubtedly had there that is probably has something to do with the honesty and the richness and so, yeah, I'm just curious. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about this.
No, yeah, and you see again, it comes back to that question of security and and insecurity. You have to feel like you're in a secure environment so that you can tell your own story. And then, as social scientists, we're trained in that. We're trained in facilitating that and getting people to speak with us. Um, Thank you. I mean, that's such an interesting and intelligent way to phrase that question. You're kind of sort of telling me that I practiced what I'm preaching before I decided that that was what I was going to preach to begin with. I did decide that at some point, there's a lot of experts talking about democracy, and many of them are professors who are talking about what should happen and how it should happen. And, I mean, who gave us the baton and made us the grand deciders? Um, let's use our position to give voice to other people and try to just put together those stories. I also had written a number of, conventional academic books, and I was just ready to do something very, very different and to approach it in a very different way. And I had an even much more expansive plan of traveling to many different countries, but many more different countries, but that was not possible. I came up with the idea because I had those one-on-one conversations, and like you, I thought, well, this can really come up to they can be pieced together into a very interesting narrative, but we need someone to tell the story in a way that's loyal to what people actually said. Um, and we have ways of guaranteeing that that happens, in terms of our methodology and how we run the interviews to ensure that we're not misquoting people and we're not misunderstanding something and all of that. But what I'm trying to say is that, perhaps there's a way to translate that into the way we run democracies or what might follow democracies. Again, we see a lot of professions that are not becoming relevant, but we haven't made room and we haven't allowed ourselves to imagine new professions that might be created solely for the purpose of serving democracy and facilitating those kinds of connections. So we could have conversational moderators, we could have community conduits, we could have people whose job it is to go and speak, have these one-on-one conversations, but they're trained to pull them together in an authentic and reflexive way, and then share them with other groups, and then eventually share them with politicians. I think we're asking people of too much. People are working more hours than they ever have, and they're going through a pandemic, and they're also saturated with information. So they have to work, they have to process information, they have to know everything about the world. And then politicians, of course, we want them to run the country and be educated about everything, but at the same time, they must campaign. And, in the United States, they start campaigning so early. So I think in order to run something and scale it up, we just need more people for the operation. And we need to just really think about, curators of content, um, storytellers, rethink the role of the librarian in an information society, grow that out, parse it out so that we have these interlocutors interspersed throughout democratic societies who are making sure that communication channels, the communication lines are not broken. I mean, I think we've always assumed that the media would do that. The media are business, and they haven't been doing a very good job at that for many reasons. I don't want to put everyone. I mean, I don't want to point the finger at all the media. There's there's journalists, there's people working in those organizations, and many of them do a very nice job. But it's the general mentality. There's a financial foundation structure of the media organization that's not very friendly to doing these kinds of things, to telling these stories that take time and take space and are not, cannot be shared with the public on the scroller.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you said just excites me and resonates with me a lot, because I think that this idea that the sort of democratic infrastructure that we need to build needs to be like human is really important, right? So that you can imagine, I mean, there are certain functions in society that humans will always be better positioned to serve, right? Like the sort of the interpretation of information, basically. So just to share a sort of a personal thing. So, I mean, I used to, I spent a year clerking for a judge, and it was an interesting, eye-opening experience for me, because I think that function that judges play, like what judges do, is a very, very unique and important thing that has to happen in society, right? Some people need to sort of there's certain kinds of interpretations and judgments that people need to make. They need to sort of happen embedded within the social fabric. And like, that's what judges are doing. And it occurred to me when I was working there that like, there's like several hundred federal judges or whatever, why aren't there more people doing this, right? There needs to be more of this happening, right? It needs to be happening at all these different levels of society. And so the idea of kind of a network, a proliferating network of like facilitators who are helping, democracy happen, who are helping, democracy sort of roll up from the ground level to the medium level to the higher level, is a really compelling vision to me. And I think, if we think about the positive potentials for, technology and democracy, I think it has a lot to do with like helping that happen.
It's true. Otherwise, we end up simplifying, everything, and then we present people with these just sort of false binaries, or, questions that have only yes or no options, or, do you want to vote for this candidate or not? And what questions in life can you answer with a yes or no? I mean, there's even like the simplest of questions, like, are you hungry? You can't really answer with a straight yes or a no.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not sure if you have ever come across the idea of like quadratic voting, which is, what we're, a big part of our work, but, that is in a way an attempt to increase the richness of information, to make it so that the information that's being passed from voters to, the democratically responsive authority is richer than yes, no.
I agree, and I crossed paths with that idea and its enthusiastic ambassadors while I was writing the book, and that was part of the connection that we formed and how we started conversing together. I agree. I think it needs. You will forgive me. I will say that I think it needs a name that's more relatable to the general public. But I think the general idea is fantastic, and it's all about. Offering a wider menu of options for citizens to select from. But still, I think, in order for that to happen, we need a lot of support people on the ground. We need these sort of facilitators who are going to be able to then work with the micro communities and figure out what are the, the trigger points? What are the important issues for that community? What is the balance between the issues and the candidates in those communities, so that, the quadratic aspect of that can be configured accurately. I do think that, there's a positive part that, AI can play in all of this. I think it can help us enhance our abilities to process things, but it's not something to be tasked to AI on its own. I think there's many ways in which I think we might be able to use AI to enhance our memory. I think there's also many ways in which we may use AI to help us train ourselves better when it comes to reimagining ways of doing things. I think we're very focused on cultivating critical literacies, and that's very, very important. We still have a long way to go there, no doubt. But I think we also need to start doing and start teaching our children and future generations the importance of work of, once literate, then you have to be able to imagine different ways of doing things. We're doing so many things. We're like sleeping, eating, dating, loving, living in the same ways that we've been doing for centuries. And again, I mean, I have to ask, does this really match? We're using all these habits that are dated and don't really seem, they're retrofitted so that they can work in our society. What does the institution of marriage, for instance, mean in societies where women are much more autonomous? So that needs to be thought over.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting potential for AI to help people understand each other, actually. Like there's it's funny how rarely you hear people talking about that as a potential application, right? It's always sort of like AI will help us manipulate the inert external world, as opposed to, helping us actually see what one another mean, give the sort of context so that we can bridge misunderstandings between ourselves and things like that. There's no reason AI can't do that.
I think so. If you get me started on this, I think people will start thinking that I've been watching too many sci-fi movies. But I think back to the late 90s, and when I first started studying these issues, mid 90s actually, and when Wired was a fascinating publication to read, and we were just running to look at it when it was published, and as a young professor, I had, a whole display of all the Wired magazines and their colorful spies. And it was just such a wonderful, techie, artful background and backdrop to my office. And of course, I don't read Wired the same way that I did then, but they were doing a lot of stories on, transhumanism and prosthetics and, just sort of chip implants, and much of because there was so little work on society and the internet done at the time. We had to draw a lot of inspiration from places like Wire, but also from science fiction novels that we read on how. So that's very much influenced, in my thinking of how AI can enhance our ways of being and communicating. I remember I think there's a novel by Bruce Sterling called Holy Fire, and the characters had a wig that they could put on that enabled them to speak all kinds of different languages. So I'm still waiting for that for that technology to appear. But so when I talk about transhumanism and using AI to work in those ways and imagining different things, and I think, and of course, we can imagine things better than wigs, and definitely things better than robots that look like pets. I'm thinking about things that, looking at AI, and right now I'm working with some of my students on thinking of ways in which we use AI or we train intelligence to, after not human intelligence, but after the intelligence of nature. So we try, because it's, we've been, as humans, we think perhaps we're a little bit too important and a little bit too superior. And I don't think we're certainly a form of intelligence, but I think we have a lot to learn from the intelligence of trees and how they nurture nature, and perhaps we can, and a lot of AI scientists are actually following that model, looking at microorganisms, looking at other organisms of nature that support fungi, for instance, to support nature in a variety of different ways to learn and design those kinds of things. So this is what I'm thinking. That's the line of thought that I'm very interested in when I talk about a certain, transhumanism um, uh, coming into the conversation. Maybe one day we'll come up with a better word for that. But finding a way to use technologies to build better bridges. Bridges are wonderful because we cross them for a variety of reasons. We cross them to conquer. We also cross them for commerce, to get closer to each other. But the whole time we're crossing them, we can still see the rivers that are separating us. So we're not losing sight of our differences. We remember why we built them. We remember what separated us. We don't forget our history, but we are still using something that enables us to move forward.
Now, the question for me is, those bridges that we build, can they be built for profit?
Yeah, so it's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah. And then the question that I have back for you is, can they be, if they're built for profit, can they also support democracy?
No,
Is there a way
I
to
don't
do?
think, I'm not saying yes.
No, no, no. No, but I'm asking the question,
Yeah.
can we come up with a way that, they're built for profit, so they're sustainable financially, but they're not just profit oriented, so they're not supporting commodification and commercialization in the reasons or the purposes why we cross. They're also supporting a number of different activities. So I think it's a question of the afterthought. If we design them with democracy as the precursor, as the
Yeah.
reason, as the rationale for this, I think we'll end up seeing a very good impact on for-profit organizations. I think we'll be able to get capitalism to work in ways that we haven't seen it work yet, and might surprise us, and it might make it more efficient. I mean, there is, again, we are running capitalism. I don't think if we ever ran it properly, but we're definitely running like, the 16th century, like 15th century model version of it for a society that's really using very, very different tools, and um, is based in an economy that's really, really much much more reliant on the politics of the stock market than it should be.
So, I mean, my worry is that if we try to build these bridges between ourselves in the service of democracy with technology, I worry that the profit motive in the stewardship of those bridges or the construction of those bridges is distorting. It distorts the signals that distorts the way that we're able to understand each other. It's an interposition between the communicating subjects, and its interests will never be the same as the interests of democracy. And that sort of distortive effect can get looped in on itself exponentially, right? So I have, just speaking for myself, I have very serious worries about whether capitalism is compatible with the construction of democratic infrastructure at all. I mean, for example, I think, and this is going back to the idea of like a judge, right? You can't have a judge for profit, right? You couldn't have a judging court. The judge has to be loyal to something else. And similarly, I think like a facilitator of a town hall, or a facilitator of a democratic deliberative process that we're trying to roll up to a larger consensus or something like that, cannot have any conflict of interest, right? That human role has to be answering to something that has nothing to do with shareholders.
I mean, I share the same concerns, primarily because I haven't seen any examples in our history, past or recent, that might indicate otherwise. But I am hopeful But I think that that is because, again, we've been using this very dated model of capitalism, and we have this conviction that this is the model of capitalism that works the best, and we're forgetting that it's a model of capitalism that was developed when societies were not really very democratic. Democracy really wasn't a thing. So we're using something, of course, we're using something that wasn't created to support democracy. It was something that, was put in place in feudal states. It supported monarchies. It supported a completely different kind of leadership. So yes, absolutely, capitalism in its current form it runs contrarian to democracy, and we let it run in a way where it just sort of becomes much more autonomous and stronger, and this a thing that just kind of runs on its own, whereas at the expense of democracy. So it would be one thing if the two were separated, but all of this is happening at the expense, at the softening uh, of democracy. So my argument would be that we also revise capitalism, and then the way that I would sell it to the capitalists is that there's a way to do this better and also serve democracy. There's actually a way to run things more efficiently. And if you want to make more money and make more profit, there is a way to do that while also having um, a very direct democratic conscience.
Yeah.
That's my point of view. But yes, in its current iteration, in its present form, no, we're running something that really just doesn't fit democracy at all.
I think ideologically we're on almost exactly the same page, but we're trapped in two different effective publics. Because what I want to say capitalism. Let's not use that word anymore. Right?
What word should we use? Yeah, let's come up with a better word. I'm not opposed to that because it does create a lot of negative sentiment.
Yeah.
Then on the other hand, if we use, socialism, that, is so misunderstood in the United States.
Right.
In the European Union, all of the countries have had their love affairs, and then like every love affair, there's at a point in the end where you're like tragically depressed when it's over. So all the European countries have had their love affairs with socialism. So yes, let's come up with better vocabulary. I mean, when I say let's do over capital, come up with a better word.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what the word is actually, but the I mean, maybe the word is democracy, but
I was thinking the same thing.
But I guess the problem is I don't want to say let's fix capitalism, because I feel like in the contestation for that word, the hedge fund people will always win. You see what I'm saying? Like I don't have enough purchase on that word to play tug of war over it. So I want to find a new vocabulary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a way to, I mean, yes, because it's no longer capitalism. It's like, hedge fundism, actually. It's transformed into that. It's really basically it's not even a stock market. It's a massive globally operated gambling market that's based on expectations and how those are read, and then at this point manipulating those expectations and using social media to manipulate those expectations, ever more expertly. So yes, but I mean, I think I have faith, in the brains of scientists and also in the brains of young people to come up with something that might be appealing to hedge funds, because they're also at some point, I mean, they can't keep outsmarting each other indefinitely. I mean, at some point they're going to get tired and they're going to need to move on to the next best thing, and then perhaps there we might be standing ready to offer that. It is, if you watch these economic cycles, they just keep moving from one to the next. But at some point, everybody learns each other's tricks and they have to invent new ones. So let's invent the next new one. Let's have it involve democracy. And without being corporate, I say, because when I say sell it, my academic friends say, oh, we don't want to be corporate. And I'm not, just because I'm presenting something in a particular frame doesn't mean that I'm being corporate. Let's frame it in a way that's appealing.
Yeah. Corporate, that's a word that doesn't have a good reputation.
And
I'm curious. So, I mean, one of the most interesting takeaways from After Democracy that left me just sort of wondering, I guess, is the idea that you talked to people who are apparently at opposite ends of the political spectrum, who are just saying things that were shockingly similar to one another. What do you think is going on there? Why do you think it is? Because I've noticed the same thing, actually. When I talk to people who are on the right or on the left, it's like they're telling me the same things.
Yeah.
And what's happening?
I think it's populism. I think, again, it's that, manufacturing of a particular voice or presentation or point of view, and presenting it as the voice of the many, as the point of view of the many, and often, misrepresenting many of the micro points of view that came together or lie behind it. This is why I write in the book about this idea of forgetting messiahs, because all too often, we look at people, and we do this in our personal lives as well. We seek out friends, we seek out partners in this way, who will complete us, who will make us feel like they will solve our problems. And the truth is, I mean, you want to talk about it from a philosophical point of view, you want to go see a therapist and talk, everybody will tell you you're the only person who can complete yourself. And you're the only person who can solve your own problems. And until you reach that level of, self-knowing and self-reliance, you're not going to be able to make decisions that will serve you well. And that's fine, because, there's a lot in that process of learning. But I think it's a mistake that we make in our personal lives. I think we make it in our civic lives. We use criteria that are not fit for electing leaders. We look at them as if we're expecting, the next messiah to come up and emerge and save us from all of our problems. And that's not just a deeply problematic expectation, it's a deeply unrealistic expectation. And now, mind you, I'm not saying that, I mean, there's nuance here. I'm not saying that these people are not charismatic. They can be a little bit charismatic, but, there's charisma, and then there's the Messiah. And, the Messiah is essentially a BS artist. I think, as a person who's able to, take a story, an idea, a truth that they have heard, and distort it into something else in order to make false promises, blown out of proportion promises, and then shift, energize public opinion. So I think we have to, when we talk to each other, we find out that we have a lot in common. But when we're described by messiahs, we're made to think like we're, sort of standing that, like, there's only binaries, there's only dichotomies in this world, and we're just sort of standing on opposite ends. So I think we have to be very distrustful of people who present as messiahs, and we have to be very distrustful of people who want to pit us on opposite sides. I think we have to be a little bit more trusting of people who are ready, who acknowledge our differences, but want to do the hard work of connecting us, while reminding us, what it is that separated us to begin with.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking when I hear that is that
I'm being naive.
No. I guess I am worried there's a deeper problem than messiahs, actually, because what I think messiahs are doing is they're making it worse. They're telling a story. They're telling really clear stories that sort of divide people. But the sort of symbolic material that they're using to create those stories like exists without the messiahs too. So for example, to make concrete what I'm saying, like if you just think about the idea of like nationalism or national identity, right? Like that, I don't know. I mean, Germanness and Italianness are there even before the demagogues show up in Germany and Italy, right? So there's like all this material that is already dividing people before the Messiah figures come along and like exacerbate it.
Yeah, they certainly they're not in. I mean, there have been some cases where they invent something out of nothing. That
Yeah.
there are such examples, but in many cases, they're taking a problem. Again, they're taking a fear, they're taking an insecurity, basically, and they're exploiting it. They're turning it into something completely different. Um, in many, they're taking historical background. You talked about, Germany, you talked about Italy. Um, Italy has seen its own share of civil wars. Germany has also seen division. So there's a lot of binaries there that are, ripe for the picking. They're ready to be exploited by messiahs. And we have seen that happen in the past. And then therein, I think, lies our own responsibility. In the book, I make 10 recommendations, but I say they must all work together. We can't just follow one and forget about the other ones. Therein lies our own responsibility to be civic adults, to just sort of own up to our own responsibilities and uh, be distrustful of those people and question them. I mean, those things are always those tensions will always exist. We can only hope that they will become a little bit softer as we grow as societies and
Yeah.
as we make democracies stronger, as we replace capitalism with a better word and a better system, as we put in all these interlocutors that help make these conversations better so that we can be better civic adults, so that we have other people to speak with and tune these messiahs out, as we also develop media that facilitate these slower conversations instead of tapping along to the rhythm, to the very stock marketing rhythm of this like news scroller that just sort of minimizes everything into a clickbaity headline. um, all of these things need to come into play so that we're less vulnerable to these tendencies, so that we have all of these things in our civic environment that are nudging us out of traps like that. So on the one hand, it's on us, and then on the other hand, we need to build a better architecture that helps us uh, helps us be less vulnerable to these all of these tendencies that will be vulnerable and will exist ad infinitum. They're part of human nature. It's kind of like how you build a house. Do you build a house just so that you can keep others out, or do you build a good, solid house that will help you live a better life?
You make a really great point that people seem to be sort of retreating into more private spheres to make politics more meaningful, or to sort of practice politics in a way that feels more meaningful to them.
They do. I think they're often let down, and especially I think with they've been doing so for a long time, but I think especially with the politics of this pandemic, we've been forced to retreat into microspheres that guarantee our own public health. I'm sorry, our own health and security, and also our sanity to a certain extent. Um, the reasons behind that are manifold, but I think the takeaway point from that is this, that we've been using technology, we've been using something like the internet for the wrong kind of thing. We've been using the internet to enable broadcasting of many to many and one to many and all of that, when we know, as you pointed out, that we're trying to scale things up that are not really, that are going to lose context, they're going to lose substance as they scale up, when in fact we could be using technology better, in different ways, to just sort of take these one-on-one conversations and layer them up, built these like imbricated layers that eventually add up to something that's much more sophisticated. So just using the internet in a very simplistic way, just because somebody told us that, we can all communicate across the globe with it, we assume that, we're gonna, oh, great, this is a great platform. And it can certainly be that, but it can be many other things as well.
It seems like I guess like when I think about what messiahs do or what demagogues do, is
Mm-hmm.
they take these private stories and they unify them. They aggregate them into a big story, right?
Yeah, I don't know if it's that they take a private story. I think they take insecurity and fear. I think if historically, if you looked at when messiahs have thrived or where, it's usually in publics that feel very financially insecure. So they take somebody's problems, somebody's financial insecurities. They take people who feel like they've been left behind for a variety of reasons. Um, Part of it is a flawed capitalism. Part of it has to do with a very soft democracy, and they exploit those fears. They exploit those insecurities, and I mean, these people are vulnerable enough to begin with, so it's it's very difficult to hold it against them. But that is precisely what they do. They get elected into office, and very soon they forget about the people who put them into office. But if you look at how Hitler employed rhetoric to rise to power, he he exploited deeply held financial insecurities of the Germans that were associated with the stock market crash and used them specifically to target Jewish populations who were involved in banking. If you look at what Donald Trump did, he went he went around and he was advised to do so in areas that have historically been not just financially unstable, but uh, vulnerable to persuasion, vulnerable uh, to the rhetoric of messiahs. I mean, a lot of those counties that, elected him into office and then elected him out of office have traditionally been counties that, flip back and forth because of financial instability. Much of it is related to globalization. And much of it is related to the inability to coal industry to decide what to do with certain energy resources and how to redirect the industry there so that we don't lose jobs, but at the same time we're preserving uh, a more we're preserving and helping make happen a more sustainable future. So a lot of those problems have been ignored for some time. They were ignored during these campaigns that again are supposed to last for a year and a half when somebody is also running the country. So it's many different things contributing to that. But at the end, it points down to, I don't think they're exploiting stories. I think they're exploiting fears, vulnerabilities, insecurities. And that's going to keep happening.
Yeah.
Because fear is a part of human nature. So we just kind of have to train ourselves to just deal with it in different ways.
Yeah,
and we have to become more secure societies too.
Right. I mean, definitely. I mean, no question. Financial insecurity is creates the ground for demagoguery. But I guess I think what I'm grasping for is like, without disagreeing with anything you said, so sort of like yes, and
Mm-hmm.
there's like it does seem to me that there are people who are vulnerable to demagogues who are not financially insecure, for example, right? And
Yes, let's talk about those rascals.
Those are the tough cases, right? And there are other forms of insecurity besides financial security, right? I mean, people are made insecure. People can be insecure about the future. People can be insecure. People feel a sense of incoherence in the world. People are afraid of death. People are always going to have fears, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I took away from After Democracy, which it's almost like we need to be comfortable with less of a clean story. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Especially when we're judging politicians, I think we have to understand, what's important and what's marginally significant. Because when you were saying before, well, there's the people who are, financially vulnerable, and then there's those who are not, and they support the messiahs. And then my response would be, well, then, and you mentioned judges, and I would say, well, then that is where diplomacy comes in, and that's where we have to elect leaders who know how to do their jobs. And perhaps we need to understand that these people have to be good negotiators in some ways, among other things. But I don't know that we're always ready to elect, the person who's going to be able to represent our interests in a way that's fair, while at the same time being able to hold court to a very noisy conversation that
Right.
at the present time in the present model includes, lobbyists. Eventually we can start, we can move forward and make lobbyists a little bit less relevant to these forms of decision makings. But based on how, we run elections, how we fund elections, and then how we run campaigns, and when we have campaigns take place, at least in the United States, we're we're disencouraging diplomacy, and we're sort of um, encouraging this sort of clientelism, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah.
that's also something that needs to go. So.
Do you have thoughts on the role that artists and media makers can play in, supporting democracy or bringing about sort of a different way of understanding how we can relate to each other?
Yes, I have so many thoughts. Artists, media makers, and scientists, I think, can play a huge part. I think I think journalists need to develop more of a habit of talking to scientists and also helping us tell better stories. Because I think often, we're not trained to speak in plain terms. We have to, and that's not a priority in our field, because we have to get tenure and do all these other things. But then once we do those things, we have to train ourselves to speak in terms that are relatable and understandable to the broad public. And we could definitely use the help of journalists in that, in communicating our findings. But we could also, we would also be appreciate, developing more of like a sacerdotal relationship with journalists, where we're not like really rushed, to give you a sound bite in like, 10 seconds, but we can have like a slightly longer conversation, not, like hours, just like 10 minutes, where we share key findings, and perhaps we get some advice from journalists on how to share those in the best ways. But I think that would lead to a much better informed public. Artists and media makers, I think, have already done so much in terms of informing the public and telling stories that draw from science. And there's a lot, again, when I say that over the past 20, 30 years, I mean, this sort of balance between a strong capitalism, soft democracy, this distance has been widening. I mean, I remember when I first started as an academic, there were government dedicated funds that went to support research in education that was focused on how to use technology to make democracy better, to support the arts, to support media making, to support those forms of storytelling. There were actually grants like that that we could apply for. Ever since, our most recent meddling post 9/11 with the Middle East, all of those funds have been gradually taken away. And all the grants that we see have to do with cybersecurity, our cybersecurity infrastructure, as if that is, the only avenue that a society can pursue in terms of research and that a government can support. So not only can they play a big part, I mean, they are the people who help us reimagine. They're the imaginary repositories of a society. That's where we go when we need to think of better ways of doing things. And so absolutely, they play a big part. I applaud technology companies who bring in media makers, who support artists, and I would only encourage them to make them a bigger part of the conversation, more vocal part of the conversation when it comes to how to design a platform, how to design an interface, and then also how to design the next thing. Because I mean, these things that we're using today, we're just, in a couple of years, we're just gonna evolve out of them. So into something different, and it'd be wonderful if an artist can imagine what that could be. Perhaps there's like a sheet that I shake, or like a curtain that I draw, and then internet appears or something like that. or none of those things, and it's in the air, particles.
So what good question have I not asked?
I don't know. You asked me excellent questions. The one about art, that's like straight to my heart. That's always, whenever I don't know what to do or I've run out of inspiration, I always just go look at some art, go to a museum, go walking around, go look at public art.
Which artists have you lately, are inspiring you?
I like a lot of Black artists. Yeah, Theaster Gates. Virgil Abloh. Simone Lee. I like. While I'm looking up my Kerry James Marshall. That is my most favorite, I would tell you. Kerry James Marshall, because it's not culturally rich and historically sensitive and informed, but there is this really weird, very new surrealism that's very unique that I just love. I like Oliver Eliasson. I've always been a fan of his work. It's just a little bit more removed, though. Kerry James Marshall, I love because it's life. There's warmth, and there's joy, and there's a little bit of pain in there, and there's hope. There's everything. Bisa Butler is wonderful as well. There's a variety of different ones, but Kerry James Marshall, and I can't believe it took me so long. My brain for a minute, died, and then just sort of came up with a name.
No, that's great though. Thanks. I look forward to digging in on those. Thank you so much for the time. What a privilege to be able to speak to you. Really grateful.
No, the privilege is mine. It has been such a wonderful conversation, so interesting, and I learned a lot. You helped me think about many things. You helped me advance my thinking.
Thanks again to Zizi Papacharissi and Matt Pruitt. This conversation was produced by G. Angela Corpus and Aaron Benavides and was shown at the 2021 Radical Exchange Annual Conference. The Radical Exchanges podcast is produced by G. Angela Corpus, Jennifer Marone, and Matt Pruitt, and is co-produced and audio engineered by myself, Aaron Benavides. And finally, we'd like to extend a big thanks to listeners like you. Radical Exchanges is a Radical Exchange Foundation production. You can help support the Radical Exchange Foundation by visiting radicalexchange.org.